In September of 1856, a storm tide pushed 6 feet of salt water through a courthouse on the Georgia coast. Clerks carried maps, deeds, and tax rolls to the second floor. Shelves collapsed. Ink bled through paper. By morning, most of the county's records had become black pulp, but one iron tax chest stayed locked. When the water fell, a state auditor named Amos Bell opened it with a crowbar. Inside, beneath a stack of property assessments, lay a red calfskin ledger from Briarbank Plantation. The book was perfectly dry. Bell expected acreage, rice yields, livestock, and valuations of enslaved people. Instead, he found one woman's name repeated across 25 years of birth records, Esther. Beside the children were 3 fathers with the same surname: Silas Vale, Jonathan Vale, Edward Vale, grandfather, son, grandson. The ledger had been designed to prove what the Vale family owned. It had survived long enough to prove what they did. Before we go further, one truth matters. The names in this reconstruction are changed. The machinery is not. What follows is a dramatized composite built from documented patterns of sexual violence, forced reproduction, family separation, and record keeping under American slavery. The people who created those systems rarely wrote the word rape. They wrote service, increase, issue, value. They hid violence inside the language of management. And sometimes, without meaning to, they left a confession in the columns. Briarbank stood on roughly 1,700 acres of tidal land south of Savannah, where rice fields were cut into rectangles by dikes, canals, and wooden floodgates. The plantation enslaved more than 130 people at its height. The wealth came from water control. At high tide, gates opened. At low tide, they closed. The system required exact timing, specialized knowledge, and brutal labor in heat, mud, insects, and disease. The Vale family called it efficient agriculture. The people forced to work it knew it as a landscape built to consume bodies. Silas Vale inherited Briarbank in 1827. He was 39, educated, wealthy, and proud of being a modern planter. He subscribed to agricultural journals. He kept weather tables. He compared rice seed varieties. He recorded the number of baskets cleaned by each work gang. He also served as a church trustee. In the same journal where he discussed drainage depth and export prices, he described human beings as instruments whose usefulness depended on discipline. Esther appeared in his records as a child. Born at Briarbank in 1815. Mother, Liza, field hand. Father, not recorded. At 7, Esther was assigned to carry water near the nursery. At 11, she was moved into the main house. At 14, a notation beside her name changed from child to house girl. At 16, Silas began writing about her in a separate private journal. Esther has grown steady in domestic service. She is intelligent, discreet, and understands the conditions of her station. The sentence looked ordinary. Then came the next line. Certain uses of house property require no public account, provided order is maintained. Bell read it twice. The wording was evasive, but the decision was not. Silas was describing the moment he chose to use a 16-year-old enslaved girl sexually. He did not call it violence because the law did not require him to see violence. He did not call it adultery because his society had constructed a racial boundary around whom it allowed him to injure. He called it use. The following spring, the plantation birth register recorded Esther's first child, a girl named Anne. Complexion, light, father, blank. 2 years later, another daughter, then a son, then another daughter. 4 births before Esther turned 23. Each child increased the plantation's assessed property value. Each child also carried visible evidence of the man who owned them. Silas never acknowledged them as family. He did not need to. Under the law, the status of the child followed the status of the mother. Because Esther was enslaved, every child born to her was enslaved too. The same act that violated her also enlarged his estate. That was not an accidental cruelty around slavery's edges. It was one of the system's central economic facts. Silas measured that fact. A margin note from 1833 placed values beside Esther's children according to age and health. Anne, age 2, $125. Infant boy, $80. Esther, $600, sound and productive. The word sat beside her name as if she were acreage. But the ledger carried another story beneath the numbers. Esther's first 2 children were born 11 months apart. A midwife's supply list showed extra linen ordered after a difficult delivery. A household account recorded laudanum. A later note reassigned Esther from laundry to lighter indoor work for 6 weeks. The family never described what she felt, but the paper recorded the damage around her. Silas and his wife, Mary Ann, had 3 surviving white children. Their oldest son, Jonathan, was born in 1811. Jonathan grew up at Briarbank, watching his father turn authority into ritual. He watched Silas inspect field gangs from horseback. He watched him decide who married, who was sold, who was whipped, who slept in which cabin, and which child was taken into the house. He also watched Esther's children grow up around him. No one explained the resemblance. No one had to. By the time Jonathan was 23, Silas had begun preparing him to inherit the plantation. The lessons were formal at first. How to calculate rice loss after a broken dike. How to compare credit terms in Savannah. How to punish resistance without reducing labor capacity. Then the journal changed. In January of 1835, Silas wrote, "Jonathan remains too governed by sentiment. He must learn that ownership divided by hesitation is no ownership at all." 3 weeks later, "I have instructed him in the private privileges of mastery. Esther is familiar with the household and will not create disorder." That is how the second generation entered the record. Not as temptation, not as secret misconduct, as instruction. Silas did not merely permit his son to exploit Esther. He arranged it as part of Jonathan's education. The plantation register made the transfer visible in a way most records did not. In November of 1835, Esther gave birth to a boy named Samuel. This time, the father was entered, Jonathan Vale. Bell stopped at that line. The ink was darker than the surrounding entries. The handwriting was Silas's. There was no hesitation in it, no attempt to obscure the relationship. Silas had recorded his son's paternity the way a breeder might record lineage. The family believed precision was a virtue. That belief became evidence. Jonathan's own journal began the same year. His early entries showed discomfort. "Father speaks of rights I find difficult to reconcile with Christian duty." Then he says the error lies in applying the language of free persons to property. Then, 6 months later, "Order has improved since I abandoned childish objections." That was the transformation Silas wanted. A young man felt the shape of a moral boundary. His father renamed the boundary weakness. The law backed the father. Profit rewarded the son. And conscience was trained to retreat. Esther was 20 years old when Jonathan's first child with her was born. She had already borne 2 children to his father. Now the son joined the pattern. The records did not preserve her words. But absence is not consent. Silence in an archive built by enslavers is often the shape of power. The people writing had pens, property, courts, and legal personhood. Esther had none of them. What she had was a body other people could command and children they could price. Jonathan married a woman named Rebecca Cole in 1837. She came from another rice family and brought a dowry that included land, furniture, and 12 enslaved people. Within a year, Rebecca was managing the household in which Esther worked. She saw Esther. She saw the children. She saw Samuel's face. A surviving letter from Rebecca in this reconstruction captures a defense repeated by white women across slave societies. There are arrangements a wife must neither invite nor examine. Peace in a household depends upon knowing which truths one is not empowered to name. That sentence did not make Rebecca powerless. It made her useful to the system. She did not create the violence. She lived from the wealth it produced. She maintained the rooms where it was hidden, and she converted knowledge into silence. Between 1835 and 1847, Esther gave birth to 6 more children attributed in the ledgers to Jonathan. Some were listed openly. Others were identified through cross-references in a family inventory. By her early 30s, Esther had endured more than a decade of repeated pregnancy, childbirth, domestic labor, and constant proximity to the men responsible. The ledger remained calm. Esther recovering slowly. Esther reassigned to sewing. Esther's infant weak. Child deceased after 12 days. No grief, no fear, no rage, only adjustments to labor. Then came the sale. In 1846, Briarbank's Western Dyke failed during a spring tide. The plantation borrowed money for repairs. Jonathan, now managing most operations, sold 8 people to raise cash. One was Esther's 13-year-old son, Isaac. The bill of sale listed him between a mule team and 2 flatboats. Price, $725. Destination, a plantation near Darien. No return clause, no family provision. No record that Esther was told in advance. Her son disappeared into a column. The money went into mud, timber, and debt. That single transaction revealed the entire structure. Silas had fathered Isaac. Jonathan sold him. The family converted blood into capital without ever granting kinship. In 1848, Silas died. His will divided property among his white heirs. Esther and her surviving children were assigned to Jonathan. The clause described them as a valuable domestic group whose separation would diminish usefulness. It sounded protective. It was not. Keeping them together preserved labor, sexual access, and control. The family unit mattered only because it increased value. Jonathan inherited Briarbank at 37. He kept his father's books. He kept his father's language. And he kept using Esther. By 1853, the birth register recorded 12 children under her name. 2 linked to Silas. 10 linked to Jonathan. Not all survived infancy. 2 had been sold. 1 was hired out in Savannah. The rest remained at Briarbank, working beside people who knew exactly who their fathers were and exactly what that knowledge could not protect them from. Esther's eldest daughter, Anne, had become a house servant. She was in her early 20s when Jonathan began writing about her. At first, Bell thought he had misread the entry. Anne has her mother's steadiness and may be relied upon in private household matters. A year later, Anne gave birth to a daughter. Father, Jonathan Vale. Jonathan had fathered a child with his own daughter. The ledger did not mark this as a rupture. It treated the birth as increase. That was the darkest truth in the book. The violence did not only repeat down the white family line, it spread through the black family created by earlier violence. A child born from exploitation could become the next target of the same man who fathered her. The genealogy folded in on itself. The account book tracked every person for inheritance and sale, but it refused the only relationships that might have imposed obligation. Father, daughter, sister, brother. Those words would have made the system morally legible. So the books used different words: girl, boy, issue, property. Esther's daughter gave birth in a room where Esther may have worked. Her granddaughter was also Jonathan's child. The ledger counted one more person. Nothing in it counted the cost. Jonathan's legitimate son, Edward, was born in 1836. He grew up in the same house, attended by people who were his half-siblings, nieces, and nephews, though the family never used those names. By 17, Edward was traveling with his father through the rice fields. By 18, he was copying numbers into the daybook. His training followed the same sequence Jonathan's had followed: water control, debt, discipline, ownership. Then, in 1854, Jonathan wrote the sentence that made Amos Bell close the ledger. Edward is old enough to comprehend the full reach of authority. My father removed such softness from me. It is now my duty to do the same for him. The next line named Esther. She was 39. She had known Edward since his birth. She had watched him carried through the house by women who were also his relatives. Now Jonathan was presenting her to him as an instrument of education. The red ledger contained one final birth entry, March 1855. Esther delivered of a girl, name Lucy. Father, Edward Vale. 3 generations, Silas. Jonathan, Edward, 1 woman, 24 years, 13 recorded births. Bell had spent his career around slavery's paperwork. He had assessed plantations. He had counted people as taxable property because the state required him to do it. He knew sexual exploitation happened. Everyone in the system knew, but most records turned away from the details. The Vale papers did not. They preserved the mechanism. The father teaching the son teaching the grandson. The woman's body turned into a classroom for mastery. Bell read through the night while storm water dripped from the courthouse ceiling. Outside, men dragged ruined shelves into the street. Inside, the dry ledger seemed almost obscene in its survival. The flood had erased hundreds of ordinary records, but iron had protected this one. By dawn, Bell had decided to write a separate report. He knew the conduct was not illegal under Georgia law. An enslaved woman could not give legally recognized consent to her owner because the law did not recognize her bodily autonomy in the first place. She could not testify against a white man. Her children inherited her enslaved status. The system had arranged every legal fact in favor of the perpetrators. Still, Bell believed an official record could force someone to see what legality was hiding. His report was 14 pages. He quoted journal entries. He traced the births. He diagrammed the family relationships. He described Esther's children sold by men who were also their fathers. He wrote that the ledgers revealed a deliberate hereditary practice of sexual coercion disguised as household governance. Then he wrote the sentence that ended his career. When law converts a person into property, it does not abolish crime. It merely transfers the power to name crime to the persons committing it. Bell sent the report to the state comptroller in Milledgeville. The answer arrived 19 days later. His property assessment was accepted. The attachment was rejected. The comptroller wrote that Bell had exceeded his authority by commenting on private domestic management lawfully exercised by citizens of this state. He ordered Bell to revise the report. He warned that further agitation would be treated as misconduct. The state did not dispute the evidence. It denied that the evidence belonged in public business. That distinction protected everything. Bell could have complied and forgotten. Instead, he spent 4 nights copying the most important pages by hand. He copied Esther's birth record, the entries naming Silas, the entries naming Jonathan, the entry naming Edward, the sale of Isaac, the birth of Anne's daughter, the passages where fathers describe teaching, sons the privileges of ownership. He placed the copies in a linen packet and wrote across the front, "To be kept until there exists a court capable of understanding them." Bell resigned before he could be dismissed. He moved north and found work with a shipping insurer in Philadelphia. He never returned to Briarbank, but he kept the packet. Back in Georgia, nothing changed quickly. Esther continued working in the house when her health allowed. A plantation medical account from 1857 listed swelling, fever, and chronic pain. Jonathan wrote that she had become less serviceable. Edward wrote nothing about Lucy's beyond evaluation. The following year, Esther died. She was 43. The burial register gave one word for the cause: decline. No diagnosis. No mention of 13 births. No mention of decades of assault. No mention of children taken from her. Jonathan's journal recorded her death in 3 sentences. Esther expired before dawn. Her long service was of material benefit to the family. A younger woman will be trained for the upper rooms. That was all. A life reduced to replacement planning. Esther was buried in the plantation cemetery beyond the last rice embankment. The grave was marked with wood. The wood disappeared. The children remained. Then the country broke apart. When Union forces took control of parts of the Georgia coast during the Civil War, many planters fled inland. Briarbank's white family abandoned the property in stages. Jonathan died in 1863. Edward joined a Confederate cavalry unit and died the following year. The men who had inherited legal power over Esther did not live to see slavery formally abolished. Her children did. Freedom did not restore what had been taken. It did not return Isaac from the plantation where he had been sold. It did not turn half-siblings into a legally protected family overnight. It did not supply land, safety, schooling, or compensation. But it changed the grammar of their lives. They could marry under law. They could choose surnames. They could leave. They could search. Records from the late 1860s show a woman named Anne Vale teaching children in a freed people's school near Brunswick. The spelling was different. The age was close. The names of 2 children matched Briarbank's register. It may have been Esther's eldest daughter. If it was, then the girl, once priced at $125 later, taught newly freed children to read the kind of words the Vale family had used to deny her humanity. That is not proof of a perfect ending. It is evidence of survival. Briarbank did not survive as a plantation. Rice cultivation collapsed across much of the coast. Dikes broke. Fields returned to marsh. Buildings rotted. The main house was dismantled for lumber. The red ledger vanished during the war years. For decades, Amos Bell's copies were the only known record of what he had seen. He died in 1891. His papers went to a small Quaker historical library in Pennsylvania, where the linen packet sat unopened in a box labeled Southern tax correspondence. In 1938, a black graduate student named Lillian Price found it while researching family separation under slavery. She recognized what earlier archivists had missed. Bell's packet was not merely evidence of individual cruelty. It documented a method. Power taught as inheritance. Sexual violence treated as management. Children converted into property. Silence maintained by law, religion, household custom, and accounting language. Price compared Bell's copies to surviving coastal tax lists. Briarbank's acreage matched. The number of enslaved people matched. Several names matched. The original red ledger was gone. The copied entries remained. Price wrote that the most chilling feature of the documents was not their emotional language. There was almost none. It was the absence of emotional language that revealed how normalized the violence had become. The men did not write like men hiding from judgment. They wrote like administrators. That is why the ledger matters. A dramatic crime can be dismissed as an exception. A system appears in routine, in repeated terms, in inherited procedures, in the same decision made by different men who believe they are not choosing at all. The veil men told themselves they were exercising rights. Their wives told themselves silence preserved order. Officials told themselves the matter was private. The state told itself legality ended the discussion. Every layer converted responsibility into procedure, and every layer depended on Esther having no recognized voice. But the archive is not silent simply because her words are absent. Her life appears in the pressure marks around the official record, the closely spaced births, the medicine, the reassigned labor, the child sold for dike repairs, the daughter targeted by her own father, the granddaughter entered as property, the final notation of decline. Those details do not tell us everything Esther thought. We should not invent her interior life to satisfy our need for closure. But we do not need her private words to know coercion existed. We do not need a confession from the victim when the perpetrators describe the structure themselves. The central question is not whether Silas, Jonathan, and Edward understood that Esther suffered. The central question is why their society allowed them to treat her suffering as irrelevant. The answer is visible in the book. Slavery did more than permit cruelty. It organized cruelty. It gave it prices, procedures, inheritance rules, and respectable vocabulary. It allowed a grandfather to teach a son and a son to teach a grandson that domination was not a moral failure but a family skill. Across 24 years, 13 births, 3 white generations, and 1 black family forced to carry the consequences, the system kept producing what it was designed to produce. Wealth for one side, trauma for the other, and records that called the result order. The iron chest protected the ledger from water. It could not protect the Vale family from what their own handwriting meant. They meant the book to prove what they owned. It became proof of what they did.